The line from Geneva to Lyon, and outside it's summer. The sun burns so strongly that the window grows hot under my hand. And there's a smell. Not really a smell, more the idea of a smell, coming through the open window like a message, like an invitation. Something dry, something sweet, something that draws me somewhere into my own history, somewhere into another life. And suddenly, in this moment, on this train, I'm not traveling to Lyon anymore. I'm back again. In Provence, and it's 1930, and I'm 25 years old, and I'm in love. Not with a person, with an idea, with a dream, with a vision of who I could be, with beauty. I'd run away from Germany, from the darkness, to be an artist, to really live. And I'd gone to Provence because all young artists go there, because the light is different there, warmer, older, because the colors are there that you see, even without looking, that you don't need to do anything but look and be transformed. I found a small painting school in Avignon, in an old building with high windows, and there I met other young people, from France, from Sweden, from Italy, from Poland, all run away from wherever. We all believe that the world can be understood through color, through light, through capturing the moment, seizing truth. And the teacher, Monsieur Gérard, an old man with white hair, constantly told us, "Go outside. Don't paint here in the studios, not in this dark room. Go to the fields. Paint reality, not your idea of reality." And so I go one morning, early, almost before sunrise, with my sketchbook, my colors, my dreams, and I find the lavender fields. They're endless, stretching to the horizon, to the line between earth and sky. Not blue like the postcards say, not blue like the sea, but violet, intensely violet, almost black in the shadows, almost pink in the lights. And the smell. Oh, the smell isn't a smell, not something you smell with your nose. It's a force. It presses you down, makes you weak in the knees, makes you hopeful, makes you think there's something bigger than you. I see a woman there. She's working in a field, cutting the flowers with a knife, carefully, no movement wasted, throwing them into a large basket. She wears a thin cotton blouse and a green headscarf, and her skin is brown from the sun. She sees me, notices me, a young man with sketchbook lost in Provence. But she ignores me, just keeps working. But after a few hours, she stops, sits beside me, very close, and looks at my sketch with a gaze that sees everything. "You're not painting the lavender," she says. Her German isn't good, but I understand. "You're painting the idea of lavender. That's wrong." I'm confused. "Wrong?" I ask. "Yes," says the woman. Her name is Marguerite, I learn later. She's the daughter of a lavender cultivator. "You're painting what you think lavender is. But real lavender, it's much more complicated. Much less beautiful, perhaps. And much more beautiful." She points at my sketch. "That's romantic. That's wrong. Come, I'll show you." She leads me deeper into the field, into the heart of the lavender, and she shows me details I didn't see. How the stem of the lavender is grey-green, not green, an old green, a green bleached by sun. How the violet isn't the same on every flower, but some are almost blue, some almost pink, some almost black. Each flower has its own color, its own opinion. How the insects, the bees, the butterflies, small beetles, they're the most important part of the lavender. The lavender needs them. Without the insects, the lavender is just color, just form. But with the insects, it's life. And the smell? I ask. What is the smell? Marguerite smiles, and her smile isn't sweet, but true. She takes a few flowers, crushes them between her fingers, and holds them under my nose. And the smell is strong, overwhelming. That's not beautiful, she says. That's functional. It's a warning for the insects. It's an attractant. It's a defense against the hot days. The smell, it's not poetry, not romantic, it's biology. The clean, hard reality. What everything is built on. And in that moment, I understand something. The dream of Provence, the romantic idea that brings all young artists to France, that's wrong. The real Provence, the real lavender, the real beauty, it doesn't lie in the romantic backdrop. It lies in the work, in the details, in the patience to look at reality without smoothing it, without coloring it with romantic notions. I see Marguerite every day after that, for 8 weeks, maybe 9, until the harvest is over. She teaches me to see the lavender, really see it, not with romantic eyes, but with honest ones. She tells me about the harvest, about the complex distillation, about the essence you can make from the flowers if you know how. And she also shows me, quite openly, quite honestly, she doesn't love this work. Not really. Not with passion. She does it because her family does, because the lavender grows here, because life requires it. But the most important thing she shares with me is honesty with yourself. You're not allowed to love what you don't love. You're not allowed to deceive yourself. You're only allowed to love what's real, what your heart truly needs. At the end, the summer grows hot, too hot, so hot that working in the sun becomes almost impossible. Most fields are harvested, the flowers are gone, and the fields are brown, sleeping, sad somehow. And I have to go back to Avignon, then to Germany. The political situation. It grows more serious, every day more serious. No one speaks about it, but everyone knows. I know I can't stay long, that soon all young men will have to leave. And Marguerite, she knows too, that I have to leave, that the summer is over, that the time is over. We don't say much goodbye. That's not the French way. We just say au revoir, which means see you again. But we both know, maybe it won't be. But every day, since that summer, when I smell lavender, whether real or in a dream, I see the fields again. And I see Marguerite, moving the knife, throwing flowers into the basket, ignoring me. And I realized that my romantic sketches weren't bad. They were just incomplete. One truth needs another truth. Beauty needs work. The dream needs reality. And now, on this train, in this summer, when the smell of lavender comes, when this fleeting, dry, sweet fragrance passes through the window, I'm back in Provence for a moment. But I'm not the young man making romantic sketches anymore. I am more aware, grateful for the woman who showed me that reality is more beautiful than any dream, that the details, the work, the patience, the honest observation, that's where the real beauty lives. The line from Hamburg to Uelzen, and it's December. The kind of December where it doesn't really snow, just gets dark and cold and sad somehow. The sky is like a great grey linoleum, getting closer all the time, as if it were falling. The train isn't full. Most people are at home, with family, with warmth, with lights. I'm here, in the corridor between two compartments, alone. And this is the first time I feel lonely, not just physically, but existentially. There's a man who's alone too. He sits on one of the fold-down seats in the corridor, in a thick grey coat, old, with stains, and he's looking out the window. He doesn't look like someone who wants to look out the window. He doesn't look like a tourist, not like someone wanting to watch. But he watches. Hour after hour, since Hamburg, for hours. I've passed a couple of times, and each time he's looking out the window, and his gaze doesn't change, doesn't move. I sit on the other fold-down seat, right beside him. Maybe too close, but he doesn't seem to mind. I don't say hello. I say nothing. I ask no questions. I just observe that he might be a veteran, that there's something in his posture that speaks of long wars, of times better left forgotten. His posture says, I am here, but I am also far away. I look out the window too, and so we sit. An hour maybe more. Time is strange here, stretches out, and we watch. Fields, small houses with lights, trees that become forest, lakes, the darkness that slowly comes like a blanket wrapping us both, protecting us. The man doesn't move. He's absolutely still, like a statue, like someone who learned to be motionless. He breathes very quietly, so quietly I think he might be sleeping, but he's not. His eyes are open, or almost open, a crack. Now and then he closes his eyes, not to sleep, not to rest, but to look, from the inside out perhaps, inward, into memory. I'm not a psychologist, not a therapist, but I'm old enough to know there are people who look inward while looking out the window, who see both worlds at once, the outer landscape and the inner landscape of memory. At some point, perhaps after 2 hours, perhaps longer, time moves differently here. The man says something, not to me directly, but to the landscape, to the window, to the darkness. It's more beautiful when you don't think, he says very quietly. It's more beautiful. I don't reply. I know he doesn't expect me to, but I listen. The man leans his head against the pane. The glass is cold, very cold, and I see his breath form, a small cloud that quickly disappears. In the war, he says, and now I can see this is something he doesn't tell often, that these words come from deep. Where I was, In the east, the days were long, very long, dark and long, and it was cold, so cold that thoughts froze. And I thought and thought. I thought about my mother, whether she was still alive. I thought about my wife. I thought about the cold. I thought, maybe if it snows, maybe it will be less cold. The thinking made me mad. It made me less human. Now I see. The man is a veteran. His hands tremble a little, or perhaps that's just the train shaking. He wears a medal, unobtrusively, on the coat. And then, he says, and it's clear this is a moment he's carried for decades. One day, my ability to think, it went out, like a fuse in an old lamp. And I couldn't think anymore. The ability was gone. I could only see. Snow, trees. The man beside me, whether he was alive or dead, I didn't know. The next hour, no more than an hour, no more than a moment. He breathes out slowly, slowly, like someone who hasn't forgotten how to breathe. And that was safer, not thinking. That was possible to survive. That was what kept me alive. Altsum gets closer. I see the lights, still far away, but they're growing. The man doesn't notice. Or perhaps he does, but doesn't care. After the war, says the man, the thinking, it came back. Not all at once, not like a flood. It came slowly back, day by day, year by year. And that was hard. Thinking about everything that happened. Thinking about the people I didn't help. Thinking about the things I did or didn't do. The thinking, constantly, always, until I grew old. He looks at me, and his gaze is clear, old, tired. And now, at the end of my life, at its edge, I try not to think. I just sit here. I look. I breathe. And I thank God there are still windows to look through, without thinking, without making words for what you see. Ulsan is now close. The train slows. I feel it in my body, in the vibrations. We still sit side by side, close beside each other, but not uncomfortably. Rather like two people who understand each other without speaking. We look out the window at the city lights, growing larger, coming closer. The life we're leaving, and the life waiting for him. The man stands up slowly, with effort, as if his body is carrying all the years. The train gently brakes. Ulsan is there. Lights, people. The end. He takes a small bag, an old bag. I notice he's kept it carefully the whole time, and doesn't look at me. Thank you, he says. But not for something great, not for something special. Thanks for not talking, for respecting, for just being there and watching with him, without judgment, without questions. And then he's gone, and I sit alone in the corridor, and I'm still looking out the window at Ulsan, at the lights, at the platforms, at the people waiting for him, perhaps. And I think, there are people so tired of thinking that they need only the simple grace of a quiet window, of another person who doesn't speak, who doesn't judge, of the ability to look without turning images into words. That's enough. That's all that's needed. That's a kind of meditation, of healing. And I'm proud I understood that I could be what he needed. On the line from Kiel to Eutin, on the first warm day of spring, when the air is still damp but opening, sits a boy, perhaps 14 years old, with a wooden birdhouse on his lap. The house isn't finished yet. The paint is partly applied, red on one side, light brown on the other, as if he's changing his mind, as if the house itself is deciding. And in the middle, raw wood, pale yellow, new, not yet aged by the sun. He doesn't look at the birdhouse, but out the window, and I follow his gaze, but I don't see what he sees. His face is serious, concentrated, but not tense or worried. The kind of concentration that says, I'm thinking about something important, something bigger than myself. His hands rest on the birdhouse, not really working with the brush, more holding it, protecting it, as if he were holding a baby, as if the birdhouse were his baby. After a while, he asks me, not directly, but somehow into my space, as if I were just there to listen. Do you know how many birds are in Kiel? I confess I don't. That delights him for some reason, and I see his face light up a bit, see the tension ease. Nobody knows, he says. The bird protectors, the scientists, they can't even count. There are too many different kinds, too many places, too much behavior. Some birds are visible by day, some by night, some only at dusk, the magic hour. Some only in spring, when they come back from the south, from Africa perhaps. Some only come when it snows, when everything else is closed, when need is great. He points at his birdhouse with a seriousness that's surprising for his age. But if I build this house, build it right, with the right hole, with the right depth, not too big, not too small, with the right smell inside from the wood, with the right temperature, with the right orientation, then maybe I'll have a bird here. Just one, maybe never more than one in my lifetime. But that's a real bird, not a statistic in a book, not a number in a database. A real life. The train travels through the flat landscape of Holstein, gently, without force. It's not raining, but it smells of rain. The grass is still wet from morning, gleams when the sun hits it. Now and then I see a tree, a single tree in a field, and the boy follows it with his eyes, for a long time, tenderly, as if counting how many birds could sit in it, what kinds, what colors. My great-grandfather, says the boy, and his voice becomes tender, becomes quiet. He was a bird watcher. Not professionally. It was his hobby. His life, really. The only thing he did right, I think, based on what I know about him. And when he died, he left 150 notebooks with bird observations from everywhere, from 60 years, his whole life in birds. The boy looks at me, and his eyes are old, older than 14. My mother, she doesn't know what to do with them. My father says it's just old stuff, old papers, waste of space. But I read one. And in these notebooks, he doesn't just write a woodpecker. He writes the time of day, how the light was, whether the woodpecker was alone or with family, with children, and what kind of voice the woodpecker had, high or deep, fast or slow. And the boy breathes out slowly. It's as if my great-grandfather is still speaking, 60 years after his death, through these birds, through these words. That's beautiful, I say, and I really mean it with all my heart. And I notice I have tears in my eyes. Yes, says the boy, but everyone else, my friends, my classmates, my teachers, my parents, they say that's old-fashioned, past. Birds aren't interesting anymore. People want mobile games, TikTok, Instagram, something quick, something that turns your brain off. Birds, nobody sees the birds. Nobody has time. He looks at his birdhouse, and it's clear that this object is his universe. But my great-grandfather, he watched birds his whole life, 60 years. And he's not depressed. He's not lonely. He's happy. I know that from his notebooks. The words are happy. And I think, if I build the birdhouse and a bird comes and I sit and watch and do nothing but watch, just really be there, then I'm not alone either. I'm with my great-grandfather. The train slows, approaches Utin, and I see the lights, small but growing. But the boy doesn't notice, or knows it, but it doesn't matter to him. My teacher, she tells me, you can't live with a dead man. That's not normal. You need to move on, go forward. But, he shows me his birdhouse. I build this house, and maybe a tit will sit here, or a finch, a small red breast. And this tit, or this finch, it's exactly the same bird my great-grandfather saw in his 60 years. Not this individual bird, but the same kind, the same nature, the same fear, the same hope. And when I look at this tit, I'm directly connected with my great-grandfather, not through time, through attention, through love. Now I see. The boy isn't sad, not like a child who can't process grief. He isn't lost. He is wise. He's understood that his great-grandfather didn't die, only that his body died, that his flesh stopped breathing. But his way of seeing, his attention, his way of looking at the world, his love of detail, that's not dead. That lives in every bird that can be watched, in every moment when you really look. The boy takes his brush. He always had one in his pocket, carefully wrapped in paper, I noticed, and paints the whole of the birdhouse, very carefully, very slowly, his tongue between his teeth, concentrated like an artist. The edge must be exact, he tells me, perfect, not a millimeter wrong, so a certain bird, or perhaps several birds, different kinds, will know that this is his house, that this is for them, that they're welcome here. This isn't architecture, he says. This is an invitation. This is saying, come into my house, come and live with me, be safe here. And if you come, then I'll see you, with my eyes, with my heart. And then my great-grandfather is here too, 60 years of attention all at once. Utin appears in the window. Lights, platform, people, the end of this journey. But the boy isn't finished with his birdhouse, and I know he takes it with him, that he hangs it in his garden, under a tree perhaps, and that he will sit and wait. Not impatiently, not nervously, just watchfully, present, like his great-grandfather for 60 years. And maybe one day a bird will come, the first time, and the boy will sit and watch with wide eyes, and he'll know that his great-grandfather is watching too, through the bird's eyes, through time, that they're watching together, and that the dead aren't really dead, not when someone looks after them, really looks with love. I met the bride between Fussen and Kempton on her way home, and she was no longer a bride, but was becoming herself again, or was on the way back to becoming herself. Though the dress, that long white dress made of real silk with 100 pearls, still wrapped around her like a question without an answer, like a secret. She sat alone in my compartment, her shoes, tall, white, uncomfortable shoes, removed and placed on the shelf, almost thrown there, as though she were saying, "Now I'm allowed to be informal for a moment. Now I can sit and think." "The wedding day was beautiful," she said, without waiting for my question, without pause, like a speech she'd memorized. I hadn't asked anything, but that was all right. Sometimes people just need another person there, a stranger, to speak, to share, to confess, almost. Everyone was happy. My mother wept, red eyes, tissues, the whole program, like in a film. His father spoke long, far too long, nearly an hour, about the family and tradition and importance. But that's normal for him. He loves his voice, the sound of his voice. And the ceremony, that was wonderful, really, solemn and beautiful. The church was full of flowers, roses, roses everywhere. I felt the cold of them. The music was right, old music, Bach, I think. And the ceremony, the old Latin form, the way his family prefers it, that was meaningful. I felt it. Everything was perfect, just perfect. But then she sat down, and that was the strange thing. That was the moment. She looked at me. She didn't know me, I didn't know her, but she needed this glance from a stranger, this silent attention. There was a crack in her voice, not dramatic, just a small crack, but it was there. And then it was over. The ceremony, everything, the party, finished. And we sat in the car, a white car, with flowers on the antenna, my husband and I, not yet a husband really, still a stranger somehow, though I've known him for 3 years, though I love him. And I felt something wasn't right. Not with him, with me, with us together. I don't quite know what. She stood and went to the window. I saw her figure in the dress, like a statue of something beautiful but foreign, and the dress rustled. Real silk, real pearls, 100 little sounds, everywhere little things moving with her. You could hear it, the sound of wealth and expectation and heaviness. She leaned her forehead against the glass of the moving train, as though the glass could cool her, as though the cold could extinguish the fire of confusion. "We're driving home to his parents for a week in the house by the lake. They just bought it. White, French, large, too large for 2 people, for 10 people almost. And I'm supposed to be happy. Everyone expects me to be happy. That's my job now. My aunt, all my aunts told me, this is the happiest day of your life, the best day. And I am, almost, in a way, yes. But it's as though I woke up this morning in this dress and realized the person who put on the dress, that was still me, the old me, before the day, before the moment. But the person who takes it off. She fell silent, searching for words that didn't come, that don't exist. I didn't ask her what she meant. It was too private, too close to her not understanding herself, too sacred almost. Instead, I said, "It's only a journey to the lake. A week. Time will tell. Not a whole lifetime." And she laughed, not happily, but honestly, a real laugh, the first genuine sound I heard from her. "That's the problem," she said. "It could be a whole lifetime. That's what my mother told me. Not directly, of course not directly, but I knew what she meant underneath her words. That's how it works. You grow together slowly, or you grow apart. The choice isn't there. You can't choose. And I don't want to discover that I didn't grow in the right direction, that I chose the wrong person, or that this person, this good man, is the wrong person for me." She put her shoes on again, slowly, concentrating, with mechanical movements, as though far away from her body, as though her body belonged to someone else. And when she sat down again, she was different. Not happy, but determined. Not afraid, but realistic. The fear, or whatever it had been, the confusion, the uncertainty, the actual panic she'd had before, had transformed into something else. Into acceptance, perhaps. Into determination. Into the recognition that weddings weren't decisions, weren't solutions. Just a day, a point on a long line. "I'll see," she said, and her voice was quieter now, firmer, darker almost. "Now I'm going to the lake with this man, with my husband. God, still strange to say. And I'll see what life shows me. I'll see whether it's right, whether we're right together, or whether it's wrong, whether I've made a mistake. If it was wrong, then, well, then it was wrong. And I'll know. I'll absolutely know. And I'm still young enough, 25, still almost a child, to change that, to change my life if I need to, if truth demands it." The train arrived in Kempton. I felt the braking, the train slowing, the wheels squealing. And she stood up, ready. The dress, it had become dark grey from dust, from the train, from reality, from life. The pearls had lost their shimmer, become duller, less royal. No longer looked like the perfect wedding dress from the church, that white dream. It looked like a dress someone had worn, lived in, actually worn through, that truly became human. And that was a difference, a big difference, an important difference. She said goodbye with a quiet, "Thank you," though I hadn't helped her much, only listened, only sat there, only presence. And then she was gone, with that white dress, its traces of dust and reality, her white shoes, her new husband waiting somewhere on the platform, probably already impatient. I still sit here and see the pearls glimmering on the window where she leaned against it, small traces of silk and hope and confusion. The train is empty now. The night streams in like a river, warm, dark. And I think about how weddings aren't beginnings. No, they're just moments, a single point on an infinite line. And everything after is the real life, the slow, imperfect life, where people have to see who they really are, who the other really is, whether they fit together or not. And that is somehow comforting, the knowledge that nothing really has to be perfect, that perfection is just a performance, that it's just a mask, that flaws are also part of beauty, that failure is also part of beauty, that life doesn't have to be perfect to be real. I met the Brushmaker between Eisenach and Suhl, on a train that grew narrow the higher it climbed into the mountains, the wheels groaning under the strain, under the weight, as though they no longer wanted to, as though they were protesting. He sat, surrounded by 3 boxes full of bristles, real wild boar bristles, dark brown, rough, alive almost, as he showed me later, carefully, with pride, with a kind of spiritual love, sorted into bundles by length and stiffness and color, by weight and flexibility, meticulously organized, methodically, like a music teacher with his instruments. His fingers were dark-stained from years and years and years in this craft, dark like the wood of the brush handles themselves, dark from stain, from oil marks, dark from a life that had flourished in his workshop like plants, like trees in a forest, like an entire forest of craft. He was an old man, 89 years old. "I am 89, he said straight away, somewhat bent, but not weak, not tired, his eyes still full of life, full of light and attention, pale blue, like 2 old, wise lakes. "I am 89, he said without being asked, as though he had to defend this number, as though someone might doubt that someone this old could still work, still want to, still be allowed to. "And I've never bought an electric toothbrush, not even a modern toothbrush made of plastic. No, never that. I still make the old ones, the real ones, from real wood, cherry, pear wood, also oak, with real bristles, with wild boar bristles, the way my father made them, the way his father made them, the way his father did before him. 3 generations, 1 line, 1 continuity in a world that becomes increasingly discontinuous." He laughed at the thought, a dry, sad laugh that sounded like cutting through wood, like the scraping, grinding sound of his daily work, like the song of his life that was now coming to an end. We spoke about how the world spins faster than before. It was 1997 then. The 90s were still young, new technology was exploding, the internet was an infant, and how a brushmaker slowly becomes an anachronism, a living museum, a walking history, a dinosaur in a new, fast, electronic time. But this didn't make him bitter, cynical, angry. On the contrary, his words were full of a kind of peace. "A good brush," he said, and his voice became quieter, slower, more philosophical, as though revealing a secret, "is like a good song. It's like reading a poem that touches you without you knowing why. You can't explain why it touches you, but it does. It reaches your heart. It stays there. And it doesn't come about because I have a machine that's faster than another machine, because I have a factory, because I can make 1,000 brushes a day. It comes about because I touch every handle before I bind the bristles, before I make the connection. I hold it in my hand. I feel the wood warm from my hand. I see its color, its grain, its shape, its history. And I sense, here, with my hands, which bristles want to be bound with it, which fit, which have the right voice. It's not divination, it's listening. It's listening to the material." He showed me a brush from his pocket, for woodwork, small, precise, with a dark cherrywood handle that was darkened by oil and time, by hundreds of hands that have held it. The bristles weren't all the same length, I noticed immediately, and that was intentional, not from lack or inability. "You see," he said, and there was pride in his voice, genuine passion, genuine love, like a father showing his newborn child, like an artist showing his work. "That's incompetence by modern standards. That's a failure in the modern world. The machine would cut all bristles to exactly 5 centimeters, all identical, all uniform, all the same, all almost soulless. But look here, when you run it over a rough board, over wood that's rough, that's alive, the short hairs find them first. The height is exactly 3 centimeters. The deep scratches and roughness, they catch them. They work into the cracks, and then the longer hairs follow, 2 centimeters longer. They smooth the surface after. They make the result even. The work becomes more uniform, gentler, more in harmony, more in balance. The brush works with the wood, not against it, doesn't fight with it. The brush understands the wood. Do you understand? It speaks with the material. It listens to the material, not to it, but with it. He told me his grandson is also learning the brush-making trade, voluntarily, not forced, not because his father or grandfather demands it, but because the child saw the craft from outside and learned to understand that it's beautiful, that it's meaningful, but in a completely different way, a new way, a way of the future. He uses new materials, nylon, synthetic fabs, plastic, the new fibers, the new technologies. He works with CAD programs, with computers, with design software. He sells online, worldwide, to people in Australia and America, to people he never sees, never meets. "That's good," the old man said, and it sounded honest, not bitter, not cynical. "I'm not jealous of his way, not competing. The world needed millions of brushes, not just one, not just my small number. But I wanted still to know that there's someone who touches a brush with his hands, really, concretely touches it, who feels it before he makes it, before he sells it, who speaks with the material, who listens to the material, to the wood, to the bristles. That's enough for me. That is sufficient. That's not hope. It's something else, something deeper. It's like praying, but with bristles instead of words. It's the same reverence, the same humility." As dusk fell, he fell asleep, his head tilted back, relaxed, peaceful, absolutely peaceful. One hand on the box beside him, protective, as though guarding the wood. The other in his lap, protective almost, waiting, ready. And I sat and watched the wild boar bristles shimmer in the fading light of the evening, in the last sunshine, like hair, like straw, like hair from animals not yet knowing they'll become a brush, that they'll be part of something greater, something important, that they have a purpose, a destiny. The train continued upward, climbing the mountain, groaning, almost gasping under the strain, under the weight, and through the mountains, through the darkening landscape, through the range. And I thought of the millions of people who tomorrow morning will take a toothbrush, without ever knowing, without ever understanding, that there are people, still are, as long as this old man lives, as long as he works, as long as his heart beats, who believe that even a toothbrush is a song, that even the most everyday things are a prayer, that even the smallest actions can be sacred, that they matter, that they're important. When we arrived in Seoul, the mountains suddenly opened out. The city lay before us. Lights, industry, modernity. He stood up, somewhat slowly, somewhat stiffly, but without complaint, without drama, without a sigh. He gathered his boxes together with methodical care, with the same care he sorts bristles, and I helped him without asking, without needing words. This habit of courtesy, this silent help, was the only language we still needed. Words would have been too much, too loud, too unnecessary. He nodded to me, a brief, old nod, like a greeting between men, like an acknowledgement, like a thanks that doesn't need to be spoken. And then he was gone, off the train, with his 3 boxes, with his bristles and his craft, with his entire life in these boxes, with his wisdom, his patience, his love of the material. A man living in the wrong time, the 19th century in the 90s, yesterday in the future, but who's accepted this so completely, so calmly, so certainly, that the acceptance itself has become a kind of beauty, a kind of holiness, a kind of blessing, a grace. And now I sit here, alone, and my eyes grow heavy from all of this, from all this precision, from all this patience, from all this love of work, from all this quietness in the face of modernity. The images blur, the bristles merge with dreams, become rivers, become grass, become hair, become everything that grows, everything that lives. The train carries me slowly away into sleep, into the dark, where all brushes are the same, and yet all different, where every brush is a song, a poem, and it doesn't matter whether anyone listens, whether anyone understands the craft. It's still true, still important, still sacred. The rattle of the wheels has a special rhythm tonight as we travel between Cottbus and Senftenberg. Ta-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. A steady, calming pattern, like the pulse of something vast beneath me. And this rhythm, this exact melody, reminds me of a May more than 20 years ago, when my wife still lived, when I was still young, when the world still lay before us. We traveled this exact route, and as we drove through a village, a magical village that perhaps doesn't exist at all, or existed only in that one moment, for us alone. The scent came first. It always came first for us. Lilac, sweeter than sweet, so sweet almost that it nearly hurt. A cloud of violet fragrance that swept through the train's open windows like something alive, like another creature getting on. It was the scent of May, of spring, of that special time when everything was possible. "We'll smell that for a long time," my wife said, and I remember thinking, no, you'll smell this scent for a long time. No, that's wrong, you'll forget it. But I couldn't know that then. This was just before she grew ill. But it wasn't that, no, she didn't know that then. It was just another happy journey with this woman whose hand I held, whose laughter I still heard. The train slowed. I felt the brakes grip, felt the speed drop, and I saw the village. It was small, nestled into a slope, with white timber-framed houses from another time, and lilac bushes everywhere. Everywhere. I repeat it because that's how it was. Everywhere. along the fences, beside the paths, in the gardens, wild bushes between the stones, white and violet, so thick you could barely see the houses behind them. The houses themselves seemed made of lilac, so much were they filled with it. The whole village was a cloud of lilac. People stood on the platforms, an old woman with a shopping basket, 2 children with a bicycle, a man with a dog. But none got on or off. They simply stood, as though they belonged to the station, like signposts, like statues, like something from another world. My wife leaned far out the window. I always feared it when she did that. Always I was tense. She had no respect for speed, for danger, for the train's weight. And she cut off a large branch. With what, I don't know. With her fingernails, perhaps, or it was so light, so ready to break. I didn't know how she did it. It was like magic, the way she did it so quickly, so surely, so perfectly. Suddenly, she held the whole branch in her hand, almost a meter long. 3, 4, 5 flower clusters packed tightly like little violet dreams, little worlds of blooms. Sweet scent, so intense it brought tears to my eyes, so I couldn't see. "We're taking this with us," she said, and her face glowed. "I'll never forget this. We'll never forget this." The train accelerated again. I felt the engine's power. The train became faster. The wheels clacked more quickly. And the village disappeared, simply as it had come. But the scent, you see, the scent became stronger, not weaker, the further we traveled from it. It was impossible, but true. The scent filled the whole compartment, our breath, our clothes. And I asked my wife, "Where was that? Which village?" And she didn't know. She was as confused as I was. She looked at her timetable, the old map she always carried with her. There was no station between Cottbus and Senftenberg, no village with lilac, nothing. Only forest and meadows and water. The village wasn't there. That didn't disturb us then. That was the time when such things were still possible. And we didn't ask why. We accepted it as a gift. That was the time when we were still young. I was perhaps 40, my wife 2 years older. Still full of trust in the world, still full of magic, not yet embittered by routine. We placed the branch on the shelf above our window. I remember exactly how the blooms struck the brass as the train took a curve. Beautiful sound, almost like music. The window glass fogging from the sweet scent. And we sat silent, both breathing in this impossible scent, this excess of beauty. The whole world smelled of lilac, was filled with it. She held my hand. Her skin was still warm, still firm, still full of life, still elastic. There were no shadows under her eyes yet. Those came later, with the illness. She was completely there, completely with me, completely happy. That was more than 20 years ago. I couldn't say how many. Time changes the numbers, makes them hazy. And since then, I've traveled this route once every year, from Cottbus to Senftenberg, sometimes even several times when May comes, searching almost, hoping. But the village was never there again. Sometimes I smell lilac, when the wind is right, when May is warm enough, when the season is right. But it's not the same. It's distinct. It smells like reality, like chemistry, like nature. That's the smell of gardens, of normal people who plant and cultivate and sell lilac. The other was quite different. The other was the scent of something else. the scent of a moment that belonged only to me, the scent of my wife, who was still with me. Tonight now, as we travel again through the dark plains of the Lausitz, through the land she knew, I think, perhaps it wasn't a village that my wife and I saw. Perhaps it was a moment so intense, so full of life, that it had to become a place. A place where we still sit hand in hand, still breathe the scent, still not knowing that we'd soon have to part, that illness would come, that time was short. A moment that wanted to be eternal, but it wasn't eternal. The train rattles on, ta-dun, 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 the rhythm of memory. And I close my eyes and try to remember, not the scent, that's long since faded, dissolved into time, but the warmth of her hand, the reality of her body beside me. As the lilac slowly fades in the night, so too this memory fades now, becomes hazy, becomes soft, becomes something only half real. My eyes grow heavy from all this remembering, from all this sorrow that is also happiness. The night is old and kind, ready to take me in. The train continues forward, rattling beneath me, carrying me away from this May, away from this village that perhaps was never there, but here, in my dreams, in my hands, in this night, it still exists, and I pass through it, year after year, searching, finding, losing, remembering. The Wooden Toymaker I met between Seifen and Chemnitz on a train that crept slowly through the Erzgebirge region and began to huff as it did, like an old person climbing a hill, reluctant but unstoppable. The wheels beneath me had a different rhythm, slower, strained, ta-dun, ta-dun, ta-dun. She sat nearly across from me, in a compartment otherwise empty, an island of quiet in this old train, with shavings on her lap, real wood shavings, fine, blonde spruce shavings, still fresh, still warm almost, still smelling of fresh work and sunshine. The shavings clung to her fingers like little memories, and her whole compartment was filled with a sweet, resinous aroma, intense and calming at once, like waking in a forest. It was this scent that caught my attention before I saw her, this forest smell, this smell of craft. "You make toys," I said. It wasn't a question. It was obvious. The scent was like proof. "Yes," she said, smiling at this certainty. "For 36 years, almost every day." Her hands were small, but not delicate, not fragile. They were the hands of someone who speaks with knife and wood better, more intuitively than some people speak with words. The knuckles were thickened, the nails short and practical, and everywhere small cuts, white lines from years of work. She told me she had a small shop in Seifen, nearly famous, known among collectors, like her mother's mother before her. A family business, passing through generations. But she had just made a decision, she said, that wasn't easy, but that she had to make. "I'm stopping," she said, and it was like a farewell in the sentence itself, like slowly letting go. "But not because I'm tired. That's the strange thing. I'm not tired. Every piece of wood I touch still knows how it wants to be carved. We understand each other, the wood and I. It's taught me everything in all these years. Patience, attention, how to listen. She showed me a toy from her bag, a horse, barely 10 centimeters tall, but perfectly proportioned, with an expression almost alive. The eyes, 2 small points of black paint, but somehow full of life. Each curve of its mane was carved individually, thought about individually, shaped individually by hand. Not uniform, but real, truly real. You could see the love in it, not as metaphor, not as sentimental feeling, but as something physical, as proof that a hand had sat over this wood and attended to it completely. But the world doesn't want this anymore, the way I make it. The world wants faster, cheaper, more. Each one costs me 4 hours, she said, and I could hear that this number wasn't easy for her, that she'd been under pressure in these years to justify, to defend this time. 4 hours, sometimes 5, depending on how the wood is, how it speaks to me. 4 hours to make joints move properly, to see where the legs should go, to polish until it shines but isn't smooth. Just rough surface texture, you see, so the small hand won't slip. To do it so that when a child takes it in their hand, there's a moment, you know, a very brief moment, where the child understands that someone here has thought very carefully, that every part was chosen, that this isn't factory, not chance, not loss of attention. She turned the horse slowly in her fingers, rotating it, examining it from different angles, wiping a spot even though it was already clean, perfectly. But now you can do the same thing in plastic. 2 minutes, a machine, a mold change, a menu item. And people say, isn't that the same? Does she only need it for play? Isn't it just a toy? But it isn't. I asked her what she would do instead, what she could do after 36 years of the same. She laughed, not bitterly, but quietly and composedly, like someone who's thought about something long and finally found clarity. I decided that on this train, she said. Just now, whilst I was talking with you, whilst I held the horse in my hands. I'm going to Bucharest, directly from Chemnitz, no detours. An old friend, Margaret, whom I haven't seen in 30 years, only letters, long, handwritten letters, only voice on the telephone, has offered me a workshop, a wonderful wooden workshop with large windows, with space for my things, with a world beyond, a new world. There's a project there for children who can't speak because of trauma, because of war, because of many things. They say that when you give them things to touch that are made properly by hand, that they sometimes begin to respond in their own way, with touch, with attention, with a trust that otherwise doesn't come. She pointed to the horse, still lying in her hands, this little, wonderful horse. This one is meant to be in that workshop in 2 months, not as a toy, as a beginning. The train braked into a curve, and I could see the village of Siefen for a brief second. Small houses, all with smoke from their chimneys. The mountains beyond like dark guardians, protective and prison-like at once. It had been her home, and she was leaving it, simply, but not from fear, from generosity. Or from a kind of generosity only people understand who know that real work is a gift, not a commodity. That a craft only stays alive when it's passed on, when it transforms. My niece inherited the shop, she told me. She wants to make toys too, but in a different way, with new techniques, with 3D printers perhaps, with other materials. And that's good. Not everything should stay the same. It should develop. She carefully placed the horse back in her bag, the way you'd lay a sleeping bird. The taste of wood doesn't leave the air, you understand. It's still there, in the mountains, in the workshops, in memory. I'm not stopping because the craft ends, but because the work I do is needed somewhere else now, where hands need comfort, where people need to learn again that something real lies in their hands. Near the end of the journey, she dozed off. Her head leaned against the window, peaceful, as though the decision had lifted a heavy burden from her. And I sat and still smelled the fine wood shavings in the air of the compartment, a scent that carried 36 years of patience within it, laid down year by year like annual rings. The train continued forward, and the mountains slowly disappeared in the dusk, became blue, became grey, became shadows. Somewhere down there lay Chemnitz, and after that Bucharest, a whole new world. But the wooden toymaker slept, her face peaceful, and her dream was already there, in Bucharest, with children who can only speak through touch, only through trust in things properly made, with hands that still know how not to destroy wood, but to free it, how to draw life from stone. The scent slowly leaves my clothes, but not really. It stays, an echo, a memory, the essence of this woman and her 36 years. My eyes grow heavy from all this thinking about work and sacrifice and transformation, about letting go of something you love to give it to others, and the gentle movement of the train carries me slowly, slowly into sleep, like a hand that knows exactly what it's doing, like the hands of this woman that know how to touch wood, how to make life. The woman with 2 suitcases. I met her on the journey from Salzburg to Linz, on a train that departed late in the evening and cut through the Danube landscape like a knife through dark water. The 2 suitcases, that's the first thing I noticed. Not because they were particularly large or small, but because they looked exactly identical. Brown leather, dark from use, with the same worn edges, placed with such precision as though every centimetre mattered, carried in the same hand, set the same way, side by side, like 2 loyal companions who still agree on everything. I saw them before I saw the woman. She sat across from me, in the weak light of the moving train, in a compartment that was otherwise empty, and it took me a while to notice she was weeping. Not loudly, not dramatically, only the way people weep when they're leaving behind a great chapter. Tears ran slowly down her cheeks, but her face remained unmoved, as though it didn't belong to her. Her hands lay in her lap, quiet, yet I could see the tension there, the barely hidden effort not to tremble. Her knuckles were white. The train rattled beneath us, steady as a heartbeat in the night. "Forgive me," I said quietly, "but you seem like you're saying goodbye to something very important." She smiled, quietly, from far away, and pointed to the suitcases with a gesture that encompassed the whole sorrow of her situation. "One of them," she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper, "is full of memories. A whole life inside, letters, photos, things you don't let go of. The other is empty, completely empty, and that's the hardest burden I've ever carried." I didn't know what she meant, but I waited. The train rattled beneath us. The night was old and mild, almost too warm for this season. And she spoke slowly, word by word, like someone who must speak a story aloud for the first time, as though speaking it would make it real. She had lived 40 years in a house, she said, in a town in Upper Austria, whose name she didn't mention. In the same village, though it wasn't a village, she called it that because that's how she saw it. With the same street corners where she walked every morning, the same neighbors whose faces became like furniture, the same routines that repeated daily like a prayer. A good life, you understand, not a bad one. No evil anywhere, no pain. But at some point, a good life becomes like a suit that's grown too tight, and you can't breathe in it anymore. The children were gone, long gone, moved to cities of their own. The husband had died 3 years ago, not dramatically, just in his sleep, peacefully. And since then, the house had grown larger. And one morning, whilst packing for a trip she would never take, she realized she didn't know who she visited anymore when she came home. And that was the moment she knew. Life was finished. So I sorted everything, she said, and her voice became more practical now, like the voice of a woman making an inventory. 10 years of photos, no longer with me, but I couldn't throw them away. Letters, nearly 100 years from my grandmother to me. A diary my mother wrote while I was being born. A blanket from my wedding, in that color that doesn't exist anymore. A grey-white that nobody makes any longer. My father's watch, which still ticks, though he's been dead 50 years. Everything in that one suitcase. Everything I couldn't let go of. And the other, I left it empty. I don't know what for. Perhaps for something new. Perhaps just to know there's space, that I'm not completely full, that there's still possibility. She spoke very quietly now, and I had to concentrate to hear her. But the new doesn't come, you see. You can't really leave a suitcase empty. You fill it with fear. I said nothing for a long time. The train carried on, and outside the night flowed past in black waves. Black fields, then a solitary house with a light in one window. Black fields again. The dull rattle beneath us again. She leaned her head against the window and looked out as though she could see something in the darkness that the rest of us couldn't see. I watched the condensation drops on the glass as they slowly flowed downward. Perhaps, I said finally, my voice very careful, an empty suitcase isn't fear. Perhaps it's a question, and questions need time to answer. Not answers, just time. She turned to me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but something in them had changed. Lighter, less hardened. Yes, she said, and it was the first time I saw her smile. Not happy, but real. A question. I like that better than fear. And then she told me of a plan. Not very concrete, a bit vague, fragments of thoughts almost. But it was there, this fine thread, like something you could pull in the darkness. A sister in Klagenfurt, whom she hadn't seen in a long time. Perhaps work in a museum where she used to volunteer years ago when her husband was still alive. The possibility of renting a room in an older house that had a large garden, and the garden was for flowers. Still uncertain, she said. Still not real. But I'll see. That's the new, I think. To see instead of to know. To question instead to answer. We didn't speak much more. The silence between us became not uncomfortable, but familiar, warm almost. She seemed lighter after speaking, as though saying it aloud had lifted a weight from her. At some point, she fell asleep, her head tilted back in a position that looked uncomfortable, but she breathed peacefully, deep and quiet. One hand rested on the suitcase of memories. I could see how her fingers touched it gently, even in sleep, tenderly almost. The other lay open on the empty suitcase, as though protecting it, or as though still filling it in her dreams somehow. And I sat in the silence and heard only the rattle beneath us, steady as a heartbeat, like the pulse of the earth itself, this ta-dum, ta-dum, that all trains on all tracks share. The window fogged slowly from within, and the night pressed its damp forehead against it, drop by drop, like a child looking at glass. Somewhere out there was Linz, where she arrived, where the suitcases would step from the train into a new world. This new world she would choose herself. And somewhere in the future, not next week, not next month, but in a time that belonged to her, that she herself controlled, this woman would know what the empty suitcase had been for. I simply knew this. You see such things. And now I sit here, and the train continues into the night, through the dark landscapes of Upper Austria, and I think of suitcases and beginnings, and how sometimes the most important thing isn't what we take, but the space we leave free. The two suitcases still stand before me, vivid, as though they were really here, as though this woman hadn't taken them, but left them behind in my thoughts. One heavy with the past, soaked in 40 years of life and love and routine. One light with possibility, open, waiting, ready. And I notice I'm thinking of her as she steps from the train in Linz, her suitcases in her hands, ready for the new. And slowly my eyes grow heavy from this hopeful thought. The night comes closer. The world grows dark and warm, and I carry the two suitcases now myself, in my dreams, light and heavy at once. I met the captain on a night train from Vienna to Budapest. It was one of those autumn nights when the air grows cool but not cold, and the darkness has a particular depth, as though it were made of velvet. The train was one of the old international services, with broad corridors and heavy doors, and curtains that smell like old theatres, of dust and memory and vanished elegance. He was sitting in the corner of my compartment, a sturdy man with a broad jaw and hands as large as frying pans. His hair was white, cropped short, and he wore a dark blue jacket with brass buttons that recalled a uniform, without quite being one. Something about him told me at once that this man had spent his life on water. Perhaps the way he sat, legs spread and solid, bracing himself against the sway of a ship that wasn't there. Or his eyes, which held that particular look, the gaze of someone used to looking far, across great distances, to the horizon. We fell into conversation, the way you do on such trains. Slowly, tentatively, starting with the weather, then the route, and then he told it. 40 years, he said. 40 years on the Danube. From the Black Forest to the Black Sea. Back and forth, back and forth. So often I could navigate the curbs in my sleep. Every sandbank, every shallow, every current. The river was my home, more than any house I ever lived in. He told me about the early hours on the Danube, when the fog still lies over the water so thick you can barely see your hand before your eyes, and the ship must feel its way forward, slowly, carefully, guided only by instruments and intuition. "You feel the river," he said. "After 40 years, you feel it beneath you, the way you feel a person's heartbeat when you place your hand on their chest. You know where it's deep and where it's shallow, where it flows gently and where it has power, where it's kind and where you must be careful." "And then," he said, "comes the moment when the fog lifts, and it's a miracle every time. Every time, after 40 years, still a miracle. The fog grows thin, it turns golden, it becomes translucent, and then suddenly you see the banks, the willows letting their branches trail in the water, the little fishing villages with smoke rising from them, the church spires growing up out of the fog like flowers from earth. And the Danube lies there, broad and blue and serene, gleaming in the morning sun like liquid gold." He told me about the Wachau, his favorite section. Steep vineyards reaching down to the water, castle ruins on the hills, apricot trees at the banks. In spring, he said, when the apricots bloom, the whole valley's white and pink, and it smells so sweet you'd think the air itself was made of blossom petals. And in autumn, when the vineyards turn golden and the vintners harvest the grapes, and the little wine taverns pour new wine, then there's no more beautiful place in the world. Then the Danube flows through paradise. And the nights, he said, the nights on the river, those are even lovelier than the days. When the ship moves quietly, and the water laps, and the lights of the cities along the bank slip past like a string of glowing pearls. Vienna at night, seen from the water. Bratislava with its bridges glowing in the dark. Budapest, where the Danube divides and the two banks are so different they might be two different worlds. Buda on one side, dark and still and mysterious. Pest on the other, bright and alive and warm. Sometimes, he said, when the ship lay at anchor in the night and the crew slept, I'd go on deck alone, just myself and the river and the stars. The water gurgled softly under the hull, and the lights from the shore reflected in it, long and quivering, as though the Danube itself were dreaming. And the silence was so perfect, you could hear the water, how it moves, how it breathes, how it passes slowly and steadily on its way to the sea. In such nights, he said, I understood why I never wanted a house on land, because a house is still, but water moves, always. And that brought me peace, to know that everything moves, that nothing stays as it is, that everything flows. I asked him what the river had taught him, and he sat thinking for a while, gazing out the window into the night, as though he could see the Danube out there, even though the train ran far from the water. And then he said, "The river knows the way. That's what it taught me." In 40 years, I learned that you can't force a river. You can't straighten it, can't hurry it, can't stop it. You can only go with it, follow its curves, accept its rhythm, trust its moods. And that's difficult at first, because you think you know better, because you think the shortest way is the best. But the river really does know better. It's been flowing for millions of years. It found the way long before we came, and it will find it long after we're gone. "You simply have to trust," he said. "Trust that the river will bring you where you need to go. Not necessarily where you want to go, but where you need to. That's a difference, you understand. A big difference. And sometimes the detour is lovelier than the straight path. Sometimes the bend is the gift. The delay that lets you see something you'd have otherwise missed. A sunset, a heron at the bank, a memory rising like a fish to the surface, brief, gleaming, then gone again. He got off in Budapest, took his old travel bag, and disappeared into the night, broad-legged and steady, as though walking across the deck of a ship. And I gazed out the window for a long time into the darkness, imagining the Danube out there, still and broad and patient, flowing through the night, through the landscape, through time. The river knows the way. I've carried that sentence with me since, in moments when I don't know where to go, in nights when everything's unclear and the fog lies thick. Then I remember the captain, his great hands, his eyes that could see so far, the river flowing for millions of years and always arriving. The train carries on, and the rattle of the wheels sounds like water flowing over stones. Quiet, steady, without haste. And I let myself drift, like a ship on the river, without destination, without fear. Only the flowing, the gentle, warm flowing, into the night, and on and on. On the line from Offenbach to Aschaffenburg, on a June day when summer's heat was beginning, a heat that transforms the whole world into honey, into sloth and slowness, I met a man who still smelled of leather, though his craft was long past being fashionable. The world of machines had taken over the world of hands, robots instead of people. His name was Franz, and his hands were dark brown from years and decades of tanning. Not a superficial color, not something you could wash away, but something that had penetrated the skin, woven in, like a secret, like a tattoo of life, like a signature that time couldn't erase, proof that these hands had worked. Franz told me he worked in a tannery by the river, the same tannery where his father had worked, and his father before him, and his father before that. At least 4 generations, perhaps 5. The story was longer, older, deeper than anyone could count. This workshop wasn't just a place, not just a business. It was a continuity, a family, a tradition, a church of craft, a sacred place where respect lived. And the river wasn't simply water. The river was everything. The river was the pulse, the umbilical cord between people and nature, between culture and biology. The river supplied the water, and the water was the tanner's first tool, the fundamental material. Water softens the skin, opens it, makes it receptive, prepares it for the life it still has to live, for the paths it will still walk. You can't make leather without water. You can't transform a skin, refine it, turn an animal material into a work of art without understanding its world, without respecting it, without entering genuine dialogue with it. He described to me the process, every step, how you wash the hides, dry them, treat them with chemicals, tanning acids, oils from trees and plants, natural substances, all taken from nature, given by nature, worked with hands. But not as though speaking of a machine, not like manufacturing, not like an algorithm, but with love, with respect, with reverence for the material. He spoke as though speaking of a dialogue between craftsman and material, between human and hide, between life and life, between two souls. The skin, he said, his eyes glowing like the fire of passion, it tells you what it needs. You must listen with your hands, with your ears, with your whole body, with your heart, with all your attention. When the skin is dry, it needs water and patience. It needs time. It needs space. When it's hard, it needs gentle movement. It needs understanding. It needs respect. When it's cracked, it needs softness. It needs compassion. It needs love. It needs healing. Every hide is an individual, has a story, a biography, has a character, has a soul you must respect. And then he told me about his last commission. A pair of shoes for a man who was 70 years old like me, old like wisdom, who had walked far, everywhere in the world. America, Asia, Africa. The shoes had carried him everywhere, had witnessed everything. The tannery had old photos of his shoes, worn, tattered, but loved, still alive somehow, still full of soul. And Franz, with his brown hands, had studied these old shoes before making the new ones. Not quickly, but over weeks, weeks full of devotion. He studied the wear, the pattern, the way the leather had already formed itself after decades, how the man's foot had impressed itself upon it, how every scratch told the story of a place, of a moment, of a life, of a joy, of a sorrow. "And you know," said Franz, and his pride was visible, glowing from his old eyes, sparkling. The new shoes didn't look like new shoes. They didn't look like a factory product, like something mass-produced, anonymous, but like a continuation, as though the foot that had worn the old shoes was continuing its journey into the new leather, like rebirth, like resurrection. The wear, the shape, everything was respected, reproduced, remembered, preserved. The foot will immediately feel at home, will need no long adjustment period, will feel no pain, will get no blisters, because the shoes already are his home. They already know him, have already taken him in. They're ready to walk more kilometers, to shelter more life, to carry more love. The train ran along a long straight stretch beside a river, presumably the Main, the river that carried Franz his whole life, that kept him alive. Franz looked out, and his eyes grew very distant, very deep, as though looking into time. And he said, his voice quiet and wise, "The river in front of my workshop is very old, very wise. It's been flowing for thousands of years, will flow thousands more, will flow forever. I go to it when I don't know how to work a leather, when I'm afraid, when I'm lost, when I don't know how to go on. I watch how the water flows round the stones, how it bends but doesn't break, how it's patient and unshakable and wise. And suddenly, I know. The river tells me how to deal with resistance, how to stay hard but also give way, how to be flexible, how to combine strength and gentleness, how to live, how life really works. I asked him if he wasn't afraid that his craft would die out. Machines do everything now, fast and cheap. Young people don't want to become tanners anymore. They want to sit in offices, not in workshops, not to work with their hands. And Franz nodded very slowly, with great sadness and dignity at once. Yes, he said, I'm afraid. But not for myself. I'm old. My life is nearly finished. I'm afraid for the hide, for the craft. The hide will always need respect. And one day, when machines have made all the shoes and people realize something is missing, that the shoes have no soul, then they'll come back. They'll search for my little workshop by the river, among trees and stone, and they'll want me to make a shoe for them, just for them. A real one. A living one. The train slowed. Aschaffenburg came closer, the city, the end of this journey. Franz stood up, very calmly, very with dignity, a man who had lived his life with purpose. And before he left the compartment, I smelled it, the full aroma of his hands, the aroma of 4 generations' love for craft, the aroma of leather and life and responsibility. And he told me, his hand briefly on my shoulder, pay attention to your shoes. They tell your story, your journey, your paths. When a shoe wears out, the way your foot has worn it, that's not bad. That's not wear. That's proof. Proof that you've walked. Proof that you've lived. Proof that you've existed. The train stopped. Franz left me, disappeared on the platform into the heat of the summer day, and I watched him. An old man whose hands were dark brown from love and patience, from decades of real work. The train began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, and I looked at my shoes. They were worn, tattered at the sides, but inhabited. My foot had made them home. My travels had shaped them. And I understood that the craft isn't the problem. Love is. Attention. Love of detail. Love. That will remain, always, as long as there are people working by hand. The train rattled on, ta-dum, ta-dum, the rhythm of life, and my eyes grew heavy, so heavy, and I fell asleep, content, happy that I had walked, that my shoes knew it, that my life was written in the leather, forever. The sound of the wheels had a special rhythm tonight, on the line from Montreux to Brieg in the Swiss mountains. The rhythm was different, slower, deeper than usual. It was as though the train wasn't simply traveling, but dancing, stepping deliberately. And it took me back to a night many years ago when I experienced something I still don't fully understand, but carry like a secret, a kind of sacred memory, a holy experience I barely dared tell anyone, because words couldn't capture it. It was a night like any other. Or perhaps it wasn't like any other at all. But I had no idea, no premonition. I sat in my compartment reading a book I'd bought at the station, a cheap edition, yellowed, the sort of book you buy when you're lonely, when you need another world. A love story, old-fashioned, with a faded cover, red and gold, from a time that no longer existed, that perhaps existed only in books. The train carried through the mountains, through the night, uphill, downhill, a rhythm that began to hypnotize, that drew me into another state. And suddenly, without knocking, someone entered my compartment. A woman, middle-aged, perhaps 50, perhaps 60, very pale, as though she'd long been away from the sun, long been away from people. Very quiet, with a quietness that wasn't natural, but was somehow otherworldly. She wore a dress of violet color, long out of fashion, perhaps from the 1960s or older, with embroideries, with history, with an aura. She said nothing at first. She didn't speak immediately. She just looked at my book with great interest, as though the book wasn't an object, but a person, a portal to something important. And she asked, her voice very quiet, barely audible above the train's rattle, above the ta-dum, ta-dum of life, "Have you read this before?" I said no. It was only the first page, maybe 20 pages in, just beginning, and the story hadn't really gripped me yet, hadn't transported me. And she said, very calmly, "Would you like to read it entirely, or would you rather see the original?" The original. What did that mean? The original of the love story? The manuscript? The real life behind it? Before I could answer, before I could even open my lips to ask, to shout, to protest, to say this is impossible, she opened the door to another compartment. And there was a library. A full library. Not a small corner, not a lonely shelf, but an entire library, with shelves reaching to the ceiling, supported by columns, with books, hundreds, thousands, perhaps infinitely many, glinting in the weak lamplight like gems, like jewels, like frozen time, like frozen dreams. It was impossible. The compartment was small, small enough that two people could barely turn about, that you could touch the wall. But there it was, an entire world of books, a library in my train, a reality that couldn't be real and yet was, cold and real and overwhelming. The woman led me inside. It was cool, airy, timeless. It smelled of old paper, of leather, of the patina of centuries, of time, of memory, of life preserved. She showed me the original of the book I was reading, a manuscript in handwriting I knew, that I'd read somewhere, that I somehow recognized, with corrections and notes, with crossed-out words, with love, with care, with the heart of an author who believed. And she said, her voice even quieter now, like a secret between us, like a whispered word, "The author never published this manuscript. She, for it was a woman, she never published it. Never. But it exists. And it's here because every story that isn't told exists anyway. It lives in another dimension. It simply waits. It waits for someone to find it, for someone to read the words, for someone to understand that it was real, that it mattered, that it counts." I wandered through the shelves, my eyes wide, very wide, my heart racing, and I recognized the books, or rather, they recognized me. They were by people I knew, or by people whose names I'd never heard, by people who were dead or still lived somewhere. A diary from a child in Poland, 1943, with tiny handwriting, with colored drawings of family, of love, of hope, before the end. A volume of poems by a woman who lived alone in a mountain hut for 30 years, writing poems in the silence of the mountains, waiting for a world that never came. Letters, thousands of letters, from people who'd never met but loved each other madly across continents. Letters never sent, lost, found, and here, rescued, preserved for eternity. The woman said, her voice now stronger, full of authority, as though coming from very far away, from deep time, from another world. This is the library of the night trains. All the stories told only on trains, they gather here. They find their way from compartment to compartment, from heart to heart, from person to person who is ready to listen, and they land here. They live on here, in this space that doesn't really exist but does, in a dimension that isn't ours but runs parallel to it. As long as there are people who listen, as long as there are people who ride trains, as long as there is night, as long as there is loneliness and hope, the stories will live on, cannot die, cannot be lost. They are immortal here, in this room. I wanted to stay. I wanted to read every book, to experience every story, to hear every lost voice. I wanted to sit here and read forever. But the woman shook her head. She said, very gently, "You cannot stay. This library exists only for those who leave, for those who understand they've been blessed, that they agree to carry the stories forward. That's the price of this grace. You must go, and you must tell what you've seen here. You must carry the burden of this truth." I went back to my compartment, and when I looked around, the door to the library had vanished. It was never there. Not physically. The compartment was again normal. A small, quiet compartment on a train, with 2 seats, a window, with the usual isolation. And I still had my book, the faded book with the love story I would never finish reading, that I didn't need to read, because I'd already seen the original. But now I read it differently, because I know that behind these words lies a story that isn't written, a life that wasn't lived, a manuscript that waits somewhere in a library, in a compartment that doesn't exist, on a train that is everywhere and nowhere. The train moves more slowly now as we approach Brigg, the last station. My eyes grow very heavy, so heavy as though they want to go home, into sleep. And I wonder if this story was real, or if it too is just a story, living in an invisible library. Whether I dreamed it, whether I'm mad. But it doesn't matter, because I tell it now, and in telling it, it becomes real. It lives now in the words I speak. It waits here with me in this compartment, while the train carries me into sleep. Very slowly, very surely, into a sleep full of books, full of voices, full of stories that never die. On the line from Weimar to Erfurt, One spring morning when the sky was grey and hopeful all at once, as though the world hadn't yet decided whether it would be day or night, whether it dared to live, as though nature itself stood between two states. A boy got into my compartment. He couldn't have been more than 14, perhaps younger, with long hair falling into his eyes, dark hair, black, the hair of a dreamer, of someone not yet fitted to the world, not yet corrupted. And in his hand he held a flute. Not metal like modern flutes, not silver and shining and technical, but wood, grey and old, worn smooth with use, with cracks like laugh lines, like the lines of an old face. The wood spoke of age, of history, of life, as though the wood had laughed long, lived long, played music long. I asked if he was a musician, if he was on tour or if he was skipping school, and he looked at me with a gaze far older than his body, the eyes of a man in a boy's face, eyes that had already seen too much. He said, "I'm learning to listen." Nothing more, not impolitely, but as though words were too loud for him, as though words would violate the silence. He simply said it, calmly. But then he raised the flute and played. It wasn't a melody I knew, more a question posed to the world, like someone calling into a deep cave and waiting for the answer, ready to be surprised again, ready to hear anew, ready to be transformed. The train rattled, ta-dum, ta-dum, but the music was stronger, much stronger. That's the strange thing about true music, real music from a real heart. It overcomes the train's rhythm. It overcomes the machine. It overcomes time. It finds its own place in the silence, in the depths, in the substance of the world. The boy had his eyes closed, and I could see he wasn't playing for me, not for an audience, not for a small gallery in a train, but for something only he could hear, something essential. Perhaps for himself, for his own path, perhaps for the wind outside, which also played on the leaves, on the fields, on the grass. Perhaps for the rails that carried us, which were also music, also rhythm, also a song sung by steel wheels. Perhaps he was playing for God, or for something like the divine. When he stopped, the music didn't end. It faded, like light leaving a lamp, like a dream dissolving. He opened his eyes slowly. He told me, his voice quiet and deep, "This flute was made by my grandfather. It's from a branch of a tree that was more than 200 years old. A very old tree, probably planted long before my family existed, by someone else who left no name behind. Planted by someone whose name I don't know, whose story is lost. The tree is no longer. It was felled 40 years ago. But the flute still sings its name. The flute carries it with me on all trains, to all places. The tree lives on in this flute. Every note is a breath of the tree. Every melody is its song." I asked where he was going, with the flute, alone, so young, on a train without family. And he said, to Erfurt, to a school that teaches the flute, an old school in an old house, in a district that rarely sees strangers, where time moves more slowly, where a master lives who still plays the old way, not classical, not modern, but simply truth, pure truth of sound. "The master," the boy said, his eyes glowing like fire, "plays so that you forget you're in the world, that you forget you have a body. Suddenly, you're everywhere, in every tree, every bird, every stream of water, in every breath of air. You hear with the forest's own ears. You breathe with the earth's lungs. You think with the heart of the universe. That's what I want to learn. That's all I'll ever need." The train crossed a landscape full of spring, full of hope and new beginnings, buds on trees bursting to open, dense and green and urgent, the sun turning everything green, everywhere, willows yellow and red like fire, like passion, like life burning. Children played in a meadow, laughing, shrieking, fighting, living. And I saw that the boy took it all in, but not with a child's eyes, with a musician's ears, with an artist's soul, with the heart of someone who'd heard who he is. He heard the color green, didn't see it, but heard it, the tonality, the song the earth sang. He heard the rhythm of the children, the bass of their laughter, the drums of their feet in the grass, the percussion of life. He heard the silence beneath the noise, the small pauses between the cries, where life breathes, where God breathes. And then he asked me something that pierced my heart, my old heart that no longer dared to ask, that had forgotten how to question. He asked, "Do you know the difference between playing a melody and becoming a melody?" I couldn't answer. What could I say to this 14-year-old boy with his old flute and old eyes, who already knew what takes a whole lifetime to understand, who already was what I still needed to become? But he didn't wait for an answer, didn't expect one, simply waited with patience, with understanding, with a kindness that old people sometimes lose. He raised the flute and played again. And this time, it was different. The music was no longer like a call into a cave. It was like an answer, as though the mountain itself spoke in reply to the boy's music. The world itself answered through this small flute. The train became only a feeling, ta-dum, ta-dum, regular as a heartbeat, the background for something much greater, the universe itself. And I understood that I wasn't just listening to a person, but to a dialogue between a boy and a tree that no longer lived, but still sang, whose voice was immortal, whose music would live on in this flute, in this boy, in me. Erfurt drew near, the city, the destination where this boy would find his master, where he would change his life, where he would become who he was always meant to be. The boy packed the flute away very carefully, in cloth, old cloth that had also come from generations, that had also been carried for decades, that had also carried love. He stood slowly, calmly, a movement full of dignity, full of knowledge of what he did, of his destiny. And before he left, he looked at me and smiled. His smile was deep, infinite, timeless, as though sharing a secret with me, the secret that life is music, and music is life, that the two cannot be separated, that they are one. And as he left the compartment, silence flowed after him, A silence that wasn't empty, but full of music, full of what was still to come, full of the years he would still play, filled with potential, with hope. I leaned back in my seat very slowly. My eyes grew heavy. My heart was full of what I'd just heard. And I understood that I too could learn to listen, not with my ears alone, but with everything I am, with my whole body, with my whole life, with my whole heart, with my soul, with the essence of who I really am.